Somewhere in South Africa right now, there is a herd of elephants standing near a waterhole, completely calm, going about their business. A speaker hidden in the bushes plays the recorded sound of a lion growling. The elephants barely react. Maybe a few raise their heads. Mild interest. Lions are a known quantity. Lions are, frankly, manageable. Then the same speaker plays a recording of a human voice, calm, conversational, not even shouting. And the entire herd bolts. Not a slow, dignified retreat. A full, immediate, get-out-of-here departure, faster and more complete than their reaction to the actual apex predator of the African savanna. This happened, by the way, not just with elephants. Researchers ran this exact experiment across 19 different species in Kruger National Park. Giraffes, leopards, hyenas, zebras, kudu, warthogs, rhinos. And the result was almost universal. 95% of species ran more, or fled faster, from the sound of a human voice than from the sound of an actual lion. The lion. The literal king of beasts. The animal evolution spent millions of years teaching every other creature on the savanna to fear. And it loses to us. Repeatedly. Consistently. Across species that have never been hunted by the specific humans making the sound in some cases, which means this isn't just a learned personal lesson, it's something closer to a deeply ingrained, almost cultural inheritance. So here's the question worth sitting with. Why? Why does the animal kingdom, almost universally, treat humans as the single most terrifying thing in the environment? More frightening than lions, than wolves, than bears, than anything with claws and teeth and a body built explicitly for killing. We're not particularly fast. We don't have claws, fangs, or any natural weaponry worth mentioning. Compared to almost anything that's ever hunted them, we are, physically, kind of unimpressive. A soft, slow, clawless primate that would lose a fair one-on-one fight against nearly any mid-sized predator on the planet. And yet something in the animal brain has learned, with remarkable consistency across continents and species, that we are the apex threat. The thing to flee from first and fastest, before the lion, before the wolf, before anything else with teeth. This is the story of how that happened, and it is a far stranger and more sweeping story than humans have guns. Let's start with the science, because this fear isn't folklore or speculation. It has been measured rigorously in dozens of separate studies across multiple continents, and the consistency of the results is honestly a little unsettling. Conservation biologist Liana Zanet and her team pioneered a method of testing this directly. They set up hidden camera speaker systems at locations where wild animals naturally gather, watering holes, feeding sites, trails, and played back different audio recordings to measure the animals' fear responses. The recordings included predator sounds like lions growling or wolves howling, alongside human voices speaking calmly, and non-threatening control sounds like birds or sheep. The cameras recorded exactly how the animals reacted. Did they flee? How quickly? How far? And for how long did they stay away afterward? Did they abandon a feeding or drinking opportunity entirely rather than risk staying? The results, replicated across continents on different species with no shared evolutionary history, are remarkably consistent. In Kruger National Park, wildlife was twice as likely to run, and abandoned watering holes about 40% faster in response to human voices than to lion sounds. The average time it took animals to abandon a water hole was just 14 seconds after hearing a human voice, compared to 23 seconds for lions, dogs, or gunshots, and 32 seconds for non-threatening bird calls used as the control. In a separate study on pumas in California, the big cats fled in 83% of trials upon hearing a human voice, compared to just 6% for a non-threatening frog control sound, and reduced their feeding time at a carcass by more than half whenever they detected a human nearby. They didn't just flee briefly and come back, many simply abandoned the meal entirely, choosing hunger over the risk of staying near the sound of a person. In Australia, researchers tested native marsupials, kangaroos, wallabies, pademelons, possums against playbacks of dogs, Tasmanian devils, wolves, and humans. The marsupials fled from humans 2.4 times more often than from the next most frightening predator, despite having had comparatively limited evolutionary exposure to humans relative to populations on other continents. Even badgers in Britain, an animal that hasn't had to worry about a large natural predator in centuries since wolves and bears were eliminated from the British landscape, showed dramatically stronger fear responses to human voices than to recordings of the wolves and bears that used to threaten their distant ancestors. The badgers had never personally encountered a living wolf. They had certainly never encountered a bear, but they were still more afraid of us than of recordings of predators their species hasn't dealt with in hundreds of years. This pattern holds up so consistently across so many unrelated ecosystems, continents, and evolutionary lineages that researchers have given humans a specific scientific designation: the super predator. Not because we're physically the most dangerous animal in any one-on-one encounter, we'd lose badly to most large predators in a straight physical confrontation, and everyone involved knows it, but because of our unique lethality as hunters at scale. Global surveys of predation rates found that humans kill prey species at dramatically higher rates than other predators do, across nearly every category of animal on Earth. We don't just hunt occasionally, the way a lion hunts when it's hungry and stops once it's fed. We hunt with extraordinary efficiency, using tools, coordination, and technology that allow a single human to kill far more prey, far more often, and far more unpredictably than a single member of any other predator species ever could. This raises the obvious question: how did prey animals figure this out so thoroughly and so quickly? Lions have been hunting on the African savanna for millions of years. Wolves have been part of the Northern Hemisphere ecosystem for an extraordinarily long stretch of evolutionary time. Animals have had ample evolutionary time to learn to fear those predators specifically, generation after generation, through countless encounters. Humans, as a hunting threat operating at our current level of lethality, are relatively recent on the evolutionary timescale by comparison. So why does the fear of humans appear to be even more deeply, more universally embedded than fear of predators with a vastly longer evolutionary track record on the same landscape? Part of the answer is learned behavior transmitted with extraordinary speed and efficiency, unlike anything that operates for most other predator-prey relationships. Unlike fear of, say, snakes, which seems to be at least partly hardwired into primate brains through millions of years of evolutionary exposure and shows up even in infants who've never seen one. Fear of humans appears to spread through animal populations remarkably quickly, sometimes within a single generation, through a combination of direct experience and social learning. An animal doesn't need to personally survive an encounter with a human hunter to learn to fear humans. It can learn by watching another member of its group flee successfully, by observing the grim outcome when a less cautious individual doesn't survive an encounter, or in social species, by the simple cultural transmission of avoidance behavior passed from parent to offspring through observation and example. A mother deer that flees at the first sound of a human voice is, in effect, teaching her fawn the correct response without a single word being exchanged, and the lethality that drives this fear isn't ancient and incidental. It's been escalating consistently for the entire span of human history, compounding generation after generation. Early humans armed with nothing but sharpened sticks and coordinated group tactics were already unusually effective hunters by the standards of the animal kingdom, capable of taking down prey many times their size through persistence, planning, and teamwork that no other predator species could replicate. No lion coordinates a hunt across a dozen individuals using hand signals and a pre-discussed plan. No wolf pack drives prey into a constructed trap. Researchers have found archaeological evidence of dedicated big game hunting weapons dating back roughly 300,000 years, long, sharpened wooden implements designed specifically for bringing down large animals, evidence that this lethal effectiveness isn't a recent development at all. From that already impressive baseline, human hunting technology only became more devastating with time. Better spears, then bows capable of killing from a distance the prey couldn't anticipate, then traps and snares operating at scale across entire landscapes, then firearms that removed the need for proximity altogether, then vehicles and aircraft that could pursue prey across terrain no other predator could traverse at any comparable speed. Every leap in human technology has been, from the perspective of the animal kingdom, an escalation in the threat level of the most dangerous thing in their environment. The lion's hunting method today is roughly the same as it was 10,000 years ago. Ours has changed almost beyond recognition in that same span, and always in the direction of more reach, more range, and more lethality. This matters because animals appear to calibrate their fear not just to the danger a predator poses in a single physical encounter, but to the overall lethality of that predator across an entire population. How often it actually succeeds in killing, how widely and unpredictably it can strike, how little warning it gives before it does. A lion is dangerous but limited in important ways. It hunts within a relatively fixed territory, using a relatively fixed and somewhat predictable set of tactics that prey species have had millennia to study and counter, and it can only kill as much as its own body needs to eat before it stops. A human can show up anywhere, at any time, using a method the prey has possibly never encountered before, killing far beyond what is needed for a single meal, with no natural ceiling on how much damage a hunting party can do in a single outing. From a purely statistical standpoint, across a lifetime and across a population, humans really have been the most successful, most unpredictable, and most far-reaching killer in just about every ecosystem we've entered. The fear isn't irrational, exaggerated, or some kind of evolutionary overreaction. It's an astonishingly accurate read of the actual risk landscape, arrived at through brutal trial and error across countless generations. Now, here's where the story takes its most dramatic and consequential turn, because not every population of animals got the memo at the same time. And the ones that didn't paid an absolutely catastrophic price for that gap in their education. There's a term in conservation biology called ecological naivete. It describes a population of animals that, due to evolutionary isolation, never developed the appropriate fear responses to a particular type of predator, typically because that predator simply didn't exist in their environment for the entire span of their evolutionary history, leaving no opportunity for natural selection to build in the right instincts. The most famous and most tragic example is the dodo. The dodo evolved on the isolated island of Mauritius, in an environment with no significant land predators at all, surrounded by ocean that kept anything large and dangerous from ever reaching the island. For the dodo's entire evolutionary history, there was simply nothing on that island that hunted large, flightless, ground-dwelling birds. So the dodo never developed fear responses to large approaching animals. It never developed the instinct to flee, to hide, to fight, or even to be particularly cautious around anything bigger than itself. When humans arrived in the late 16th century, the dodo's complete absence of appropriate fear meant it would reportedly approach human sailors with simple curiosity rather than alarm, walking right up to the very creatures that would ultimately be responsible for its extinction. That total lack of caution, combined with active hunting and the introduced rats and pigs that raided its ground nests, drove the dodo to extinction within roughly a century of first contact, a stunningly short window for a species that had thrived for an immeasurably longer time before humans showed up. This pattern, island species evolving in isolation from large predators and then collapsing catastrophically the moment humans arrive, has repeated itself with horrifying regularity throughout history, on island after island, continent after continent. Researchers studying global bird extinctions since the year 1500 have found that over 90% of them occurred on islands, overwhelmingly because of exactly this kind of evolutionary naivete. The animals simply had no instinctual framework for recognizing a human, or the species humans brought with them, like rats and cats, as something to be afraid of. There was no ancestral memory of this threat to draw on, no inherited caution passed down through generations, because for thousands upon thousands of generations, the threat genuinely had never existed at all. Compare this to the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands, which famously show no fear of humans at all even today, allowing tourists to walk right up to them and take photographs at close range. Or the penguins of Antarctica, which display a similar fearless curiosity toward people, often waddling right up to researchers rather than away from them. These animals aren't naive in the sense of being unintelligent. They've simply never had the evolutionary pressure to develop a fear response to a large land-based threat because no such threat existed in their environment until very recently. And in places like Antarctica, protective international treaties under the Antarctic Treaty System have ensured that humans never become a genuine danger to them, so the fear response never had a reason to develop in the first place. Their wariness, where it exists at all, is calibrated entirely toward the predators that actually hunted them across their evolutionary history. Orcas and leopard seals for many seabird species, hawks for certain island birds like the Hawaiian goose, which retains its caution around hawks but shows none toward mammals. And it stops precisely there. They retain fear of the threats their ancestors actually faced and nothing else, which is a remarkably precise, almost surgical calibration of fear to genuine historical risk, with no margin allocated for threats that never actually materialized. This is the crucial contrast that makes the broader pattern so striking and so informative. In most of the world, in mainland Africa, in the Americas, in Asia, in Australia, animal populations were exposed to humans in one form or another, for long enough that the fear had time to develop and spread, generation after generation, until it became deeply, almost universally embedded across entire ecosystems. On isolated islands, where humans arrived suddenly and recently with no warning and no time for the lesson to be learned through the slow grind of natural selection and cultural transmission, that protective fear simply never had the chance to form. The difference between a population that fears humans intensely and a population that doesn't is, in many cases, simply a difference in how much time evolution and social learning had to do their work before we showed up on their particular patch of the planet. There's also a deeper, more ancient layer to this story, reaching back tens of thousands of years before any of the modern research existed to measure it. The role humans may have played in the disappearance of the megafauna, the largest animals our planet has ever hosted in the post-dinosaur era. Across multiple continents in a pattern that has fascinated and divided paleontologists for decades, the arrival of modern humans correlates strikingly with the disappearance of the largest animals in each ecosystem. Mammoths in North America and across Eurasia. Giant ground sloths in South America, some of which stood taller than a modern elephant. Massive marsupial predators and giant kangaroos in Australia, animals so large they'd be almost unrecognizable as kangaroos by modern standards. In each case, these enormous animals had survived for an extraordinarily long time without humans as part of their environment, weathering ice ages, climate shifts, and competition from other predators. And then, within a relatively short window after humans arrived on their continent, they vanished entirely. The exact cause is still debated vigorously among researchers. Climate change at the end of the last ice age certainly played some role in many cases, and the relative contributions of climate versus human hunting pressure remain an active and sometimes heated scientific argument. But the overkill hypothesis, which proposes that human hunting was a major driving factor in many of these extinctions, has substantial supporting evidence, particularly because the timing of megafauna decline lines up so consistently with the arrival of humans across multiple, geographically separate, and otherwise unrelated continents in a pattern that climate change alone struggles to fully explain. If this hypothesis is even partially correct, it means something fascinating about the deep history of animal fear. The largest, most physically dominant creatures the planet has produced, animals that had nothing whatsoever to fear from any other predator due to sheer size, mass, and power, encountered humans and were, within a remarkably short evolutionary window, hunted into non-existence. The animals best equipped to survive virtually everything else the planet could throw at them, the ones that had outlasted every other natural threat for tens of thousands of years, were not equipped to survive us. That is an extraordinary statement about what kind of threat we actually represent in the broader sweep of natural history, and it offers a deep historical layer to explain why the fear response we see today is so consistently and so universally calibrated toward humans specifically, rather than toward the traditional apex predators that share our environment and have for far longer. There's an interesting and slightly more hopeful wrinkle to this story too, because the fear that animals have learned toward us doesn't only produce tragedy, In some surprising and almost paradoxical cases, it has become something prey animals actively exploit for their own protection, turning humanity's terrifying reputation into an unlikely shield. Researchers have documented a phenomenon sometimes called the human shield effect, in which prey animals deliberately position themselves close to human settlements, specifically because predators are even more afraid of humans than the prey species are. White-tailed deer and moose have been observed giving birth closer to houses and roads than they otherwise would, essentially using the presence of humans as a deterrent against wolves and other predators who fear us even more than the deer or moose themselves do. The fear of humans in this strange ecological inversion becomes a resource that smaller, more vulnerable animals can leverage to their own advantage. We are so frightening to predators that prey species have learned, in effect, to hide in plain sight beside the very creature most ecosystems treat as the ultimate threat, calculating, correctly, that the wolf trailing them is even less willing to approach a farmhouse than they are. It's a genuinely strange thought experiment worth sitting with for a second. A deer, fleeing nothing in particular at that moment, deliberately moving closer to a farmhouse, because the wolf trailing it somewhere in the tree line is more afraid of the farmhouse's occupants than the deer is of the wolf. The most feared creature in the ecosystem has, in some very specific and almost accidental contexts, become an unwitting ally to the very animals it could otherwise hunt itself. So, why did animals learn to fear us? Not because of any single encounter, and not because of any one piece of technology that flipped a switch overnight. It's the accumulated result of hundreds of thousands of years of escalating human lethality. Sharpened sticks becoming spears, becoming bows, becoming firearms, becoming vehicles, combined with a hunting strategy built on coordination, planning, communication, and tools that no other predator on the planet has ever been able to match or even meaningfully approach. It's the demonstrated outcome, repeated across continent after continent and species after species, that when humans arrive in an ecosystem, the largest and most dominant animals frequently do not survive the encounter, regardless of how dominant they had been for every prior age of that ecosystem's history. It's a fear so statistically justified, so consistently reinforced across countless generations of direct and observed experience, that modern wildlife researchers have had to formally classify us using our own scientific category. The super predator, distinct from, and apparently superior to, in terms of inspired fear, every other apex predator that has ever shared the landscape with us. And it's also, in the saddest and starkest cases, a fear that simply never had time to form at all. In the dodos, in the countless island birds wiped out within decades of first contact, in every species that evolved in total isolation from us and paid an unrecoverable price for that isolation the very moment we finally showed up, on their shores. The elephant that bolts from a human voice faster than from a lion's roar isn't being irrational, skittish, or overly dramatic. It's reading an extraordinarily accurate threat assessment, one calibrated by an almost unbroken record of evidence stretching back through the entire shared history of our two species on this planet. We like to think of ourselves as the clever, relatively harmless primate who builds cities, writes books, debates philosophy, and occasionally goes camping to reconnect with nature. But from the perspective of nearly every other species on this planet, measured not by our self-image but by their own evolved, hard-won, and repeatedly validated instincts, we are, and have apparently always been, the single scariest thing in the room. On the savannah, in the forest, and at the waterhole. And somewhere out there, right now, an animal that has never personally met a human, that has no direct memory of ever being hunted by one, is still going to run the moment it hears our voice. Because somewhere down the evolutionary chain, something learned that lesson on its behalf, paid for it dearly, and passed the warning forward. And it has never, not once, needed updating.